the great fundamental issue now before our people can be stated briefly. It is, are the American people fit to govern themselves, to rule themselves, to control themselves? I believe they are. My opponents do not.
Individual enterprise. I am in favor of protection. I believe in the permanent court and further limitation of armament. I am opposed to aggressive war.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
Whether we shape the future in the image of our hopes is ours to determine by our actions and our choices. If we succeed, generations to come will say of us now living that we mastered our moment.
Americanism, not globalism, will be our credo.
America first, America always. This is The Right Take.
Hello, everybody. How is it going? Welcome. This is episode number 92 of The Right Take. We are so excited to be back. It was a bit of a hiatus. So sorry, guys. A nearly 2-week hiatus there. I, of course, am Eric Lendrum, here with my co-host Jacob Grandstaff. And we've got a lot to talk about on this episode, believe me. I'm going to come right out and say one big reason why this episode was a little delayed. One, I was very, very busy with my regular job. But two, I don't know about you, Jacob. For the last 2 weeks now, the news cycle primarily has been dominated by one stupid thing. Balloons! It's nothing but these stupid
UFOs.
UFOs. Right. So, I'm sorry. Yes, I got to refer them by the correct pronouns. Yeah, they're UFOs technically. They identify as UFOs. But yeah, Chinese balloons, now like multiple UFOs. Are the aliens really finally trying to make contact with us and we just keep shooting them down because we're paranoid of China? Who knows what's going on? But it's nothing but these balloons. That's all you're seeing on the news. That's all you're hearing about everywhere. It was kind of funny at first for a while, but now I'm just sick of it. And for the longest time, there was just nothing else going on in the news. But now, finally, there is more to talk about. There is more to laugh at. And there are more serious discussions to be had that don't involve these flotation devices of suspicious unknown origin that keep just entering our airspace so mysteriously. So first off, my forte, as always, as you guys know, is elections. I love elections. They are my blood sports. I know I'm that much of a nerd. And the big one is coming up, guys. I mean, yeah, we've got a little off-year cycle with 2023, of course. The biggest races there being the governor's races in Kentucky and Louisiana. But, of course, the presidential race is the one that everyone really wants to talk about. And it has officially begun in earnest. We have the first official challenger to President Donald J. Trump, the undisputed frontrunner for the Republican nomination. And it is, of course, as I like to call her, the Neocon in heels. I know you're going to love this, Jacob. Here's just a snippet from Nikki Haley's announcement video.
We must turn in that direction again.
Republicans have lost the popular vote in 7 out of the last 8 presidential elections. That has to change. Joe Biden's record is abysmal, but that shouldn't come as a surprise. The Washington establishment has failed us over and over and over again. It's time for a new generation of leadership to rediscover fiscal responsibility, secure our border, and strengthen our country, our pride, and our purpose.
Okay.
I mean, I guess if she's comparing herself to Joe, she could consider herself a new generation.
Exactly.
But I got to agree with Don Lemon on this, that she's a little bit over the hill to be considering her, at least to be considering herself a new part of the new generation. Like, you got to be 35 to run for president. She's 50.
Exactly. Yes, that's the thing. I'm going to come back to that in a bit. But yeah, she's 51. So that ties into them. How it makes no sense, the comments she makes later on in her presidential announcement. I'm struggling to speak. I am stammering because I am just so flabbergasted by so much that was said there. First off, I gotta drill down this one. The one thing that really annoys me, the one thing that gets my goat from all that, Jacob, she repeats the same garbage we've heard from Ben Shapiro and others. Republicans have lost the popular vote in 7 of the last 8 presidential elections. Number one, we have an electoral college for a reason, folks. We're not a direct democracy, thank God. If we were, this country would have been down the drain a long time ago, or at least more so than it currently is. We have the electoral college for a reason. The popular vote does not matter. And as long as California exists as it does right now in this current state, we're never going to win the popular vote again. That's just a fact. California is going to give a Democratic presidential candidate 5 million more votes than the Republican, just like that, in an instant, for free. No strings attached whatsoever as far as Democrats are concerned. So it doesn't matter, number one. Number two, of those 8 presidential elections, they always say 7 of the last 8, 7 of the last 8, from Bush Sr.'s loss in 1992 up until 2021. Do you know what the one exception is, Jacob? The one Republican who won the popular vote during that 8 election cycle streak?
Well, Bush's re-election in 04.
Bush Jr. in 2004 against John Kerry. So first off, in order to have that happen again by Haley's metrics here, we got to hope the Democrats nominate someone as brain dead as John Kerry, which is never going to happen again. 2, what does that mean? Bush was the winner of the popular vote. So does that mean we need to go back to Bush? We need to go back, not just any Bush.
That's what her argument is. That's basically, she is a Bush Republican, and that's what she's going to run on. She's going to argue that, well, look, Bush won the popular vote. You need to elect someone who thinks like Bush, who has heels, and I'll be able to do it.
Exactly. And that's not, the 2000 era Bush, who was still kind of a blank slate politically and culturally, other than, of course, being the son of a former president. This is 2004 George Bush, the neocon, the one who had already invaded half the Middle East by that point. That's the president we should hope to emulate, which, by the way, as I love pointing out, electoral math here, Bush ultimately managed to win that election in 2004 by winning literally every single swing state in the country minus New Hampshire. He won Florida, Ohio, Iowa. He won Colorado, New Mexico, North Carolina, every swing state. And he only got 286 electoral votes, I believe, versus Trump, who lost a lot of those. He lost Colorado, New Mexico, Virginia. But because he flipped the Rust Belt, he got more electoral votes than Bush Jr. ever did. All right. So you're arguing that we should return to a campaign strategy that basically says we need to fight for the littlest electoral scraps, like 5 electoral vote New Mexico, instead of continuing to pursue the Rust Belt where the real money is, electorally speaking. So it's just a nonsensical statement. It's another talking point that means nothing. And you'll quickly find, and this is what I was going to get back to with the age thing, Nikki Haley's campaign very much consists of the most boring, basic, focus group tested, planned out Karl Rove talking points you have ever heard from a Republican candidate. And this was evident in her first rally. We don't have any clips from that, but I was watching it live on Fox News, so I'll just recite some of the lines for you. It was in Charleston, of course, her home state. Why not? By the way, Jacob, I don't know if you noticed this. Fox News was carrying her first presidential rally completely live and uninterrupted. When was the last time?
No, I did not know that.
They did.
That is interesting.
Sounds familiar. When was the last time they did that for President Trump, by the way? When was the last time Fox carried one of his rallies?
Well, they used to all the time back in 2016. I don't believe that they did. They did 1 out of 3 in 2018. And 2020, they had pretty much written him off.
Exactly. They especially stopped after 2020. But certainly, nowadays, it's Newsmax and RSBN, Right Side Broadcasting Network. Those are the only 2 that still carry Trump speeches. And, of course, his Rumble channel, President Trump's Rumble channel. But, yeah, Fox stopped giving Trump coverage and giving him a platform a long time ago, obviously, with the shift by Rupert Murdoch from the very top, especially after the midterms when DeSantis won re-election. That was the flip. That was the coin flip. Now, Fox, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, they are all the enemy. They are against Trump, and they are all for whoever the establishment is. They promoted DeSantis, and now they're promoting Nikki Haley. So they carried her first presidential campaign rally, and among other things, during that rally, she repeated that popular vote line, last 7 of the last 8 elections. She described, at one point she said, quote, "We can't bring America into the 21st century if we keep trusting politicians from the 20th century," end quote. So wait a minute. Nick, as you point out, Jacob, she's 51
that
years...
makes no sense.
Exactly. She's 51 years old. She started serving in the public life in, I think, the mid-2000s, if that's what she's going for. But again, she herself is old. She's technically a member of Gen X. You can't have... That makes no sense, because if you want to talk about bringing America to the 21st century, which is another garbage talking point, by the way, given where we are right now in this 21st century we have now, Jacob, 23 years in, between all the endless wars, and now trannies running around trying to groom children, and black nationalists burning down half the country. If this is the 21st century, I'd rather go back to the 20th century. I don't know about you, Jacob, but I think most of us agree at this point. Take us back to the 50s, please. I'll even take the 90s back at this point, Bill Clinton and all. But again, to bring America in the 21st century, you're basically saying, someone would have to run for president who's born in the 21st century. So someone who's 23 or younger, which constitutionally you can't run for president. You cannot run for president until you're 35 years old or older by the constitutional requirements. So it makes no sense whatsoever. That's a nonsensical talking point. This line was my favorite / non-favorite, anti-favorite line from the speech. Jacob, you'll love this one. Nikki Haley described herself as, quote, "a brown girl growing up in a black and white world," end quote.
She started doing this, I noticed, right after the Black Lives Matter movement took over, or I should say was invited into corporate America after the George Floyd death.
Yes.
She started describing herself as a brown girl in a black and white world. She never described herself. I never heard her describe herself as that before that. And what this is the rich, wealthy, these are the wealthy Republicans, which she is an example of, simply trying to mold themselves into the culture. They have no interest in shaping culture. They have no interest in driving culture. They simply want to hold on to their wealth, and they will do whatever the left wants them to do, but they'll try to put a conservative spin on it. And that's, that rather than say, no, we shouldn't categorize people by the color of their skin, it's okay, no, I'm going to embrace that as a brown girl. And by the way, she is incorrect. She did not grow up as a brown girl in a black and white South Carolina. She grew up as a white girl in a black and white South Carolina. She would have never been considered quote unquote brown. There's no such thing as brown. That is straight out of academia. That is not a colloquial terminology to refer to anybody. You're either in America, you're either black or white. And she grew up as a white girl in a black and white South Carolina.
Yeah, brown has kind of come to be like a all-encompassing for generally it's perceived as referring to Hispanics, but you could also technically refer to Arabs. You could refer to Indians with brown. It's such a nonsensical term that a friend of mine pointed out, black and brown being used by the left is their attempt at lumping black Americans in with all other minorities. Again, like the progress flag with the brown and black stripes added in on the top of the tranny colors and everything, as if to say, all minorities are in this together, even though, I mean, again, you take one look at like the LA riots, for example, and other instances where most minorities don't get along with each other in these urban settings, especially. So I'm sure certainly, again, the BLM movement is not about to turn around and, become friendly with the La Raza movement. It's not going to happen. So again, like you said, they're trying to take the left's ideas, culturally and ethnically, and put a conservative spin on it. And that probably explains perfectly why her campaign website, as of the time of this recording, folks, does not have an actual platform of any kind. She doesn't list any policy stances. But it's okay. God, this is the grift you should expect. It does have a merch store, of course, featuring shirts and mugs bearing, I guess, the unofficial slogan of her campaign, which is, quote, "Sometimes it takes a woman," end quote. I mean,
wow.
You can't make this up.
That's worse than anything Hillary Clinton ever came up with.
That's more cringe than what Hillary did. Hillary very much presented herself as a historic candidate, like, I am gonna be the first woman. Nikki Haley is more like, I'm a woman, tee-hee. Like, she doesn't embrace the severity of it, like, as Hillary Clinton did, which made it all the more hilarious when Hillary Clinton lost.
This is what rich conservatives will do. This is what rich country club conservatives will do. They'll try to embrace the movements of the left, whether it's anti-racism or feminism, but they don't want to go too far because they understand that they'll alienate certain conservatives who aren't comfortable with that. So they'll try to embrace it just enough to kind of win over the people who are, but also want to keep their taxes low, but don't want to go too far. And Nikki Haley is the face of country club republicanism.
Absolutely, absolutely. And just as a reminder, because I think we can agree, Jacob, she's not going to win the nomination. She's not going to be president.
No.
Best case scenario, as some have speculated, she is just running for a cabinet position or maybe VP, so she could that way end up in a second Trump administration. Hopefully not, but we'll see. Again, thankfully, the only position Trump ever gave her was ambassador to the United Nations, which I remember reading, I think it was a Tom Clancy novel, or I could be wrong, some political novel that described ambassadorships in general as what they would call an FO position, which stands for F off, an F off position that a president gives to someone they don't like. So, hey, go off to Rome and be my ambassador to the Vatican so I don't have to deal with you in this country, for the remainder of my term, something like that.
Kind of like Trump did to Newt Gingrich, huh?
Yeah, but at least he likes Gingrich. At least he
literally sitting to Rome.
No, I was not referencing Gingrich there, folks. That I disavow. I was not insulting Gingrich. That was just a random example that popped in my head because we like Gingrich generally speaking compared to someone like Haley. I mean, I'll take Gingrich any day in the administration over Haley. I'd rather him be VP or chief of staff before I would ever let Haley be anywhere near the top of the executive branch. But nevertheless, we are going to bring the hammer down on her. We are going to list all the reasons why you should despise her as if they weren't obvious enough already. And this requires going back into her history to 2015 and 2016. This is the reason for which I will always hate Nikki Haley. And this is why, literally, if she somehow, by an unholy miracle, became the nominee, I would not vote for her. I would sit out that election. In 2016, she explicitly, by name, blamed then candidate Donald Trump for the Charleston church shooting in 2015, where an actual white supremacist, like a real neo-Nazi, shot up a black church. She blamed specifically Trump's, quote, rhetoric. And speaking of Charleston, it was shortly after the shooting in 2015 when Nikki Haley, this is the thing people need to remember. We saw it, especially in the aftermath of Charlottesville. A lot of people said Charlottesville and the right-wing peaceful protest there that was attacked by Antifa rioters. People say that was the catalyst of the anti-Confederate movement. Statues being torn down, the Confederate flags being taken down. That definitely was a big powder keg, but that was not the spark. The spark, the beginning of the anti-Confederate movement was Nikki Haley, who after the Charleston church shooting signed a bill into law ordering the South Carolina state capitol to take down the Confederate flag and order the banning of Confederate imagery on state government grounds. So kind of like people kind of forget this too, how sometimes the most horrible scourges culturally in our society today, the most insidious campaigns by the left, are actually started by cucked conservatives like Nikki Haley. Kind of like, for example, the whole Russian collusion hoax was not started by the left. It was not started by Hillary Clinton's campaign. It was started by a supposedly conservative publication called the Washington Free Beacon, on behalf, which supported Ted Cruz in the 2016 primaries. They first kind of concocted this Trump is secretly a Russian asset. He talks to Vladimir Putin, all that stuff. And that eventually gained enough traction. It was then picked up by the Hillary campaign. And the rest, we all know the rest from there. The rest is history. But you got to remember, these people, these so-called conservatives who start these movements, these countercultural zeitgeists that ultimately end up being very harmful to our country and basically threaten to rip our country apart at the seams. These people absolutely should not be trusted anywhere near public office whatsoever. And on top of all of that, if that's a little too scholarly, if that's too ancient history, that's too in-depth, then here's another very simple reason why we should oppose Nikki Haley. And it comes in the form of another video cut. This is from, I think, about 2 years ago, maybe a year ago. Very recent history, folks. This is after she had served in the Trump administration.
He still has a lot of popularity. If he runs again in 2024, will you support him?
Yes.
If he decides that he's going to run, would that preclude any sort of run that you would possibly make yourself?
I would not run if President Trump ran.
Oh, what happened there, Nikki Haley? I said this to one of my coworkers the other day. Could you imagine for just a second, Jacob, how nice it would be if in the United States of America it was a crime for a politician to lie in an interview the same way it's a crime to lie before Congress? And that's why I love this. Before we move on here, just two more quick things. President Trump addressed Nikki Haley's entrance into the campaign in the most Chad way possible, the most Donald Trump way imaginable. Quote, "I'm glad she's running. I want her to follow her heart. even though she made a commitment that she would never run against who she called the greatest president of her lifetime. She should do what she wants to do and not be bound by the fact that she said she would never do it. The more, the merrier, end quote. This is a new style that some of my friends, I have some friends, regretfully, who are DeSantis shills at this point, DeSimps, as I like to call them, and they freak out. A little while ago, Trump made a post on Truth Social after the State of the Union where he said something roughly along the lines of, Biden worked very hard tonight. It's not something that comes to him naturally. It never has been and never will be, but he worked hard tonight. And these DeSantis freaks were freaking out like, oh my God, Trump's complimenting Biden. What is he doing? And I'm like, do you not understand Trump's humor? His number one favorite method of going after his opponents is outright roasting. You know, low energy Jeb, little Marco, calling Ted Cruz a Zodiac killer, stuff like that. That's his number one method. Number two is the backhanded compliment, like that with Joe Biden, and like this with Nikki Haley. She should follow her heart, even though she promised she wouldn't do that. You know, she shouldn't be bound by what she promised you all she wouldn't do. Like, it's backhanded compliments, and I love it. That is just so savage. It's so great. And they're going to have a lot of fun on that debate stage. He's just going to effortlessly wipe her off without a second thought. And again, she's polling in like the low single digits. She's not going to be the nominee. But like Trump said, the more, the merrier. Speaking of which, there are other rumblings of people who are talking about running. Of course, also from South Carolina, Senator Tim Scott has formed an exploratory committee. That'll be interesting. And let's not forget, this one kind of flew under the radar a bit. John Bolton, one of Nikki Haley's predecessors as ambassador to the United Nations, he announced his plans to run for president against Trump in 2024. In an interview on a British news channel, by the way, not even an American one, but very recently he was on Meet the Press to respond to Nikki Haley's announcement, and get ready for this episode of Pot, Meet, Kettle.
I think Nikki's really running for vice president. That's my sense. I think she has a problem because she first said she wouldn't run if President Trump ran. And her justification for changing was that a lot of things have changed, which I don't think is very convincing.
So you think she has a credibility problem going into this race?
I think Trump will have a lot of fun with her. I quoted Mike Pompeo in my book, something he said about Nikki Haley. He said she's light as a feather.
And the fact he has to quote Mike Pompeo to gang up on Nikki Haley is like, oh, she's light as a feather. Like, all these neocons already ready to tear each other's throats out before the primaries have even started. I love it.
A lot of people were throwing Mike Pompeo's name out there as a potential 2024 candidate, but he's just Pompeo. You have to have a certain look. And Pompeo, I believe, has just eaten a few too many cheeseburgers to have that look, to make him look presidential. See, Trump can get away with it because he's got the personality, the bombastic personality that people are drawn to. Mike Pompeo doesn't have that, so he can't compensate.
Exactly, yeah. Although he has lost a considerable amount of weight if you see him on Fox News these days. His face does look very like gaunt and narrow. Like
probably a lot less stress.
Yeah. But that is, as a friend of mine suggested, that's a man losing weight because he's getting ready to run for president. So we'll see. In my betting pool, I absolutely think Pompeo is going to run for president 100%. Take that to the bank. Tim Scott basically announced he's running. Asa Hutchinson, former governor of Arkansas, is probably going to run as well. I'm actually of the hot take, we can get into this in a later episode, but I'm of the hot take that DeSantis will not run for president. That's just me. We'll have to wait and see what happens.
So one of the issues that has been coming up since Biden became president is the question of who is actually president, like who is actually pulling the strings behind the scene, because it's very obvious that Biden is not all there, that he's just a face to try to unite the Democratic coalition, that he's not actually calling the shots. And Roger Kimball wrote a fantastic article in American Greatness, and we'll link to that in the description. And he basically makes the argument that it's more of like a government by committee. Like it's not one or two people who are behind the scenes running the show. It's basically, multiple people who have the same agenda and the same ideology. They are guiding the administration. Of course, Biden is the face of that administration. I would argue that of all the cabinet members, the most powerful is Antony Blinken. He is the most powerful cabinet member, the most powerful member of the administration, most influential. He's been with Biden, been close friends with Biden all the way for years, going back to the Obama administration. He was the Undersecretary of State under Obama. He grew up in a diplomatic family. I think it's his uncle, his grandfather, and his parents, I believe, were all diplomats. So he grew up as basically an international baby. And so he is like an international, rather than a military brat, a diplomatic brat. So his loyalty is more or less to the ideal of America's foreign policy since World War II, rather than to the idea of the nation state. And we're going to get into that in a little bit with a few clips from speeches that he's given. But the thing with Tony Blinken is, used to, before the vice president was the next in line to be president, the Secretary of State was the one who was basically the presumed nominee for the president's party after the president served 2 terms. This was especially true during the 1800s. And eventually the VP, it became a more powerful position. I don't believe that Tony Blinken has presidential aspirations. I think he is very comfortable simply guiding America's foreign policy and even domestic policy to some extent behind the scenes. But in order to understand why the United States has essentially declared a proxy war on Russia, and why Hillary Clinton, the Democratic Party, were so gung-ho about getting involved in Syria during the 2016 election. If you remember, that's why a lot of moderates voted for Trump, because they genuinely believed that Hillary would get us into a hot war with Russia over issues that did not concern the average American citizen. Well, here we are. We got another Democratic administration, and we are essentially in a proxy war with Russia over a country and issues that don't concern the average American citizen. I mean, unless you were born in Ukraine and you immigrated to the United States, the average American doesn't really care about this stuff that much. But to understand why we're involved, it's important to understand Blinken's understanding of America's role in the world and America's military. So he gave it an interview with NPR recently. And I covered this, by the way, just a little footnote. I've recently started writing for Valiant News. If you want to check out my work over there, this is actually from an article that I wrote for Valiant this past week. So I'll go ahead and link that into the description as well. A little shameless self-plug there. But anyway, so if you look at this interview that he gave with NPR News, he was asked about Russia's war in Ukraine. And he didn't indicate that it says that Blinken, quote, Blinken didn't indicate Russia's war in Ukraine was nearing a resolution as it approaches the 1-year mark. He said, in order to achieve lasting peace in the region, Russian President Vladimir Putin must first give up on his notion that Ukraine is not its own country. And of course, I mean, not to get in the weeds, but Putin has never claimed that he wants to take over all of Ukraine. He simply wants to take over the eastern third of Ukraine. Blinken said, quote, if we ratify the seizure of land by another country and say, that's okay, you can go in and take it by force and keep it, that will open a Pandora's box around the world for would-be aggressors that will say, well, we'll do the same thing and get away with it. And notice he says, if we ratify the seizure of land by another country, as if the United States is already a hot participant in this war. Technically, it's up to Ukraine if they want to ratify the seizure of their own land, if they want to come to a peace accord with Russia. It's not up to us since we actually haven't officially declared war on Russia. He said, quote, I think here's the challenge. No one wants peace more and more quickly than the Ukrainian people because they're the ones who are suffering from this aggression. But it also has to be a just peace and a durable peace. It has to be a peace that reflects the principles of the United Nations Charter that preserve Ukraine's territorial integrity. So he's essentially giving stipulations for where and when and how Ukraine is allowed to sue for peace. You know, Ukraine. He recognizes that Ukraine is bearing the brunt of this military engagement. They're losing tens of thousands of people. They've lost hundreds of billions of dollars. They're completely reliant on Western governments, not only for weapons but also for the future survival of their country. But he's basically saying, you know, I understand how they might want peace, but it has to be a just peace. It has to be a durable peace, and it has to be a peace that preserves Ukraine's territorial integrity. In other words, Russia must give back Crimea. Russia must give back all of the Donbass, and they must completely abandon the territory that they've taken. So what Blinken is saying that is we cannot have peace in Ukraine until Ukraine achieves total victory. And again, he uses we as if the United States is a direct participant in this war. In a speech at George Washington University, Blinken defined, you know, he always uses the term rules-based order. This is, if you listen to any of his speeches, he always talks about how Putin and Russia have been violating the rules-based order, as if this was some kind of order that Russia sat down and signed, agreed to, and now they're breaking the order they agreed to. But he said at George Washington University, Blinken defined the rules-based order. He said, quote, the system of laws, agreements, principles, and institutions that the world came together to build after 2 world wars to manage relations between states, to prevent conflict, to uphold the rights of all people. So this is what he believes that the war in Ukraine is about, is maintaining that rules-based order. He also has a vastly different understanding of NATO compared to most Americans and the rest of the world. Most Americans who think about NATO. They understand that NATO was an alliance created by the United States and Northern European countries. That's why it's called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to combat Soviet influence and the allies of Eastern Europe. Back in the 1940s and 50s, you had the Warsaw Pact and NATO that came into existence as opposing military blocs. Once the Warsaw Pact dissolved, NATO was the sole reigning leader of world alliances, of global military alliances, and it exists to protect its members. At least that's the way most Americans would understand its purpose for existence, to protect all of the members. That's not how Antony Blinken sees it. He sees it as pretty much an arm of the United Nations. He sees it as the military arm of the United Nations to enforce the UN Charter. So when the UN Charter was created, there was no UN. There was a UN peacekeeping force. But of course, that's always been a joke. Anytime the UN peacekeeping force goes in, you might have a few hundred Nigerians, a few hundred Egyptians, a few hundred Israelis, a few hundred Americans thrown together in a little piecemeal force that really don't have any teeth. This is why the UN peacekeeping forces have always been kind of a joke. Blinken wants the NATO forces to be the teeth of the United Nations. Now, what's interesting in this speech, and we're going to play a clip of it here, his speech at George Washington University, he was very careful not to tie the rules-based international order in with Western values or Western civilization, it's interesting because in Europe, they always tie in opposition to Russia with defense of Western civilization. They tie it in with defense of Western values. And they tie in, equality, diversity, all these things that American liberals like to tout. Western Europeans tie all of that in with Western civilization. Blinken is very careful not even to do that. So he's not even telling Americans who love Western civilization that these values are our shared Western values.
Its founding documents include the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which enshrine concepts like self-determination, sovereignty, the peaceful settlement of disputes. These are not Western constructs. They are reflections of the world's shared aspirations. In the decades since, despite daunting challenges and despite the gap between our ideals and some of the results we've achieved, the countries of the world have avoided another world war, an armed conflict between nuclear powers. We built a global economy that lifted billions of people out of poverty. We've advanced human rights as never before. Now, as we look to the future, we want not just to sustain the international order that made so much of that progress possible, but to modernize it, to make sure that it represents the interests, the values, the hopes of all nations, big and small, from every region. And furthermore, that it can meet the challenges that we face now and will face in the future, many of which are beyond what the world could have imagined 7 decades ago. But that outcome is not guaranteed, because the foundations of the international order are under serious and sustained challenge. Russian President Vladimir Putin poses a clear and present threat.
So, in his worldview, he's not defending a government that started in 1776, and he's not interested in lifting millions of Americans out of poverty or building a strong American economy. He represents a system and a government that was founded in 1945, and that's why everything he talks about revolves around the past 7 decades. He's interested in building a global economy. He wants to see billions, not millions of Americans, but billions of people worldwide in every nation lifted out of poverty. And these are the ramblings of someone who is not an American. This is someone who literally does not have loyalty to the United States. They instead have loyalty to an ideal. In his mind, this person's mind, he is representing an ideal. And the United States is simply a weapon to be used in the furtherance of that ideal. Now, the Council on Foreign Relations is basically a who's who of foreign policy elites in Washington, D.C. And this was a speech that Blinken gave to CFR back in early 2016, when he was still serving in the Obama administration. At the time, he was the Undersecretary of State. And so he goes a little bit further into his view of the liberal international order and this rules-based order that he supports and that he serves, essentially. So we'll play a little bit from his speech to CFR.
Part of our challenge is it's hard to help some of our fellow citizens imagine what the world would look like without the advantages for all of the deficits of this multilateral rules and norms-based system. It would mean, though, building ad hoc arrangements every single time we wanted to act. An extraordinary diplomatic lift that would distract us from the real challenges at hand. It would be a world where goods are fewer and more expensive. Businesses move slower. The appetite for risk is lower. Where travel is harder, educational exchange is tougher, international research collaboration near impossible. It would mean anarchy on the high seas, with pirates, drug traffickers, smugglers, sanction violators sailing freely, and a global power vacuum filled by those whose values don't look anything like ours. To abandon that system, the liberal international order that we have spent so much blood and treasure to build over these last 7 decades. Now's the time to strengthen it, to adapt it to new realities.
So what he's describing is democracy. Like what he is describing as the alternative to the liberal international order is democracy, where the people would come together and decide through elected representatives, how to run business, how to conduct foreign policy, how the United States should interact with the rest of the world, bilateral relations, something that the Trump administration strongly supported, which is one of the main contentions that the liberal foreign policy establishment had with the Trump administration, is the fact that Trump did not believe in multilateral agreements. He wanted to deal one-on-one with foreign powers, have our representatives sit down with Japan's representatives and hash out a trade treaty, sit down with Mexico's representatives, hash out a trade treaty.
Yes.
The only compromise he really made was by reforming NAFTA. But what Blinken is essentially describing is democracy. And he's saying that, if we had democracy, then things would move slower. You would have pirates on the seas. You would have everything would grind to a halt. You would have total chaos, which is why we don't need democracy. Basically, we need a bunch of technocratic elites to decide these things for the people so things can move smoothly. Now, there was a professor here who was the speaker at the CFR convention. He engaged in Blinken in conversation, and he told him that part of the problem, the reason why you're seeing a lot of pushback, because remember, this is early 2016 when Trump is on the rise, the Trump movement is gaining steam, and he tells Blinken that perhaps the reason why we're seeing so much pushback and revolt is because the American people were never consulted on any of this and never agreed to any of this. Let's take a listen.
Well, let's kind of pull back a little historically, because I noticed you talked about after World War I and after World War II, we had these debates. To me, it's always interesting that after World War II, actually the United States first decided we're going to wash our hands of everything. We demobilized, we were coming home, and it was really only when Stalin sort of began to move forward in Eastern Europe that Truman was able to kind of painfully rally the country there. Interestingly, after 1990, we didn't have that debate. We didn't. Cold War was over. What are we going to do? We're going to build a new world order. We're going to extend the West to the East. I'm not sure that the American people bought into that. I buy into that, by the way, but I'm not sure that maybe the lack of that public debate. And I think the way that people like us at CFR and so on in both parties handle that was to say, look, don't worry, people. It's going to be cheap and it's going to be easy. Now that the Soviet Union is gone, it's not going to cost a lot of money. There's not going to be a lot of risk of war. America's going to be able to put a lot less into the international system, but take a lot more out in terms of human rights and so on and so forth. I'm not sure a lot of people ever really believed that. And now what they're doing, when one gets the feeling people are looking at this world that is so very unlike the world that George H.W. Bush or Bill Clinton suggested we were headed into. Where's that end of history thing gone? And so there's a tremendous skepticism now, and we're sort of having the debate now that we would have had in 1990. Is that tally with what you see?
I agree with that, and I think
First off, I gotta interject. I mean, the audacity that these people have at this point to openly use the phrase "New World Order," knowing full well.
Keep in mind, they're not doing it openly. They're just doing it among themselves. They don't figure that anybody would ever hear any of this conversation, even though they're posting it online.
Right, but then also he goes on to say, like, the American people didn't sign up for that. So that's why it's up to us. Like here at CFR and people in both parties, suggesting this consensus.
Yeah, no, he says both parties. He recognizes that both parties are in on this.
Yep, and it's their job. It's essentially, it's our job to convince those rubes, those uneducated American voters who just want to put America first. It's our job to convince them. And I love the reasoning, too, he uses. The way we can convince Americans to do this, it's cheaper, guys. We may be, instituting like an ideological empire, but it'll be cheap. We'll be fiscally responsible the whole time. And I'm just like, you've got to be kidding me. These people are deranged with the levels of power that they seek to achieve and unfortunately have achieved at this point.
Now, Blinken, even though he said at the end, I agree with you. Of course, that's diplomatic speak. It doesn't matter what the person says. The person could say, we're going to genocide half of our population because they're kind of a problem.
Thanos
I agree
snap.
with you.
Yeah.
They are a problem. But let's look at other alternatives, that type of thing. Like this is complete diplomatic speak. But he says, even though he says, I agree with you, he basically changes the subject. And we'll play, it's kind of a little bit of a long clip. We'll go ahead and play it as he kind of rambles about the Middle East, changes the subject. But he essentially at the end says that the Truman Doctrine decided what America's foreign policy was going to be and what America's raison d'etre, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but the reason is America's reason of existence was going to be after World War II, and that Truman Doctrine carried even after the Cold War. Like you didn't need to renew that with the American people because Truman already decided it. Like that's basically his answer to that. But we'll go ahead and take a listen.
Part of what we're seeing is the basic organizing principle. The nation state is under challenge in ways that it's never been before. From below, from above, from the side. We have all sorts of non-state actors, whether it is the CEO of a major corporation, the mayor of a megacity, an NGO, a super empowered individual for good or for bad, in different ways challenging the state. We have countries, particularly, for example, in the Middle East, that have been unable to effectively deliver for their citizens who are under challenge, old orders fading away, vacuums that tend to be filled by more extreme forces, not more moderate ones. And all of this is coming to a head, and again, it's driven in many ways more quickly by technology, by information. Right. And again, that feeds into this sense of chaos, the sense of confusion, and it feeds into questioning whether the basic premises, the basic organization that we agreed on, you're exactly right, when Truman really came into the game, and then that we renewed after the Cold War is the right thing.
And basically what he's given is the typical liberal response to why people would be discontent with this utopian system that they set up after World War II. He blames, it's, when governments don't really respond to the needs of their citizens, as in, we need more welfare. We need to throw more welfare at the rubes, or technology. The rubes just don't understand technology. Technology has really exacerbated the issues with globalization because it's allowed the rich to get richer, the poor to get poorer, and you have the dumb rubes who just simply can't learn how to code. I mean, that's kind of that's the implication that a lot of liberals take, and that's there. When you ask them why is it that the average people are growing discontented with this liberal international world order, those are the reasons they'll give you. It's not, they'll never criticize, they'll never critique their own system. They'll never look at their own system and stop and think, hey, maybe this system goes against human nature. Maybe your average person actually isn't built physically or mentally to support something like this. Maybe it's our fault that people are angry. No, it's always, that they're just too dumb to understand technology, or we need to do a better job of throwing money at them and creating a bigger welfare state.
Well, and also, I got to point out something else, too, he mentioned there, as he talked about, look at countries like the Middle East, where they aren't really doing much for their people, and, like, the old ways are kind of dying. Like, it basically kind of not so subtly suggesting what they always talked about is we need to just help liberalize Afghanistan, right? We just need to introduce Western values to these nations, to Iran, because
global values, global aspirations,
global value.
That's international aspirations.
That's right, of course, because this was done. Obviously, this speech took place before the fall of Afghanistan, which we saw how that went. We spent 21 years trying to liberalize Afghanistan. And the end result is that even before we left, as we were on our way out the door, the Taliban came steamrolling back in. They took over the country. And they did so with apparently a lot of support by the people of Afghanistan, who are ready to go back to an Islamic theocracy. They don't want an occupied, mini America, a Middle Eastern remake, a Bollywood adaptation of America, right? They just wanted to go back to the way things were before the Americans came in, just like they wanted to go back to the way things were before the Soviets came in, and the way things were before the British tried to come in. Like, it's always happened. You can never liberalize these countries, one of the oldest regions in the world, with those traditions that have and those beliefs, especially the Islamic beliefs, that have lasted as long as they have for a reason. And
moving on
actually, real quick before we move on, I pulled this clip up. This is a perfect thing because we always try to talk about like solutions or what the response to that. I want to play a clip from Trump's Warsaw speech because I think that's like a perfect counter to this. So, and of course, where can we even begin to talk about a solution to this? I can't believe I have not yet found an excuse to play a clip from any of this on the show. I consider this, Jacob, to be the single greatest speech President Trump ever. It was early in his presidency. It was 2017. It was his Warsaw speech. He was speaking at the War Memorial in Warsaw, Poland, commemorating the resistance fighters who fought against the Nazis. And it was all about Western identity and the importance of preserving the West.
We have to remember that our defense is not just a commitment of money. It is a commitment of will. Because as the Polish experience reminds us, the defense of the West ultimately rests not only on means, but also on the will of its people to prevail and be successful and get what you have to have. The fundamental question of our time is whether the West has the will to survive. Do we have the confidence in our values to defend them at any cost? Do we have enough respect for our citizens to protect our borders? Do we have the desire and the courage to preserve our civilization in the face of those who would subvert and destroy it?
That is, there it is. That's all you need to know. That is the best possible response to this, that we should be at absolute best maybe a more cooperative group of individual nations that all put our own interests first. The EU leaves Hungary alone, for example, and lets Hungary do their thing with their immigration laws and cracking down on degenerate education / indoctrination, and they leave Hungary alone. An EU that respects Brexit and doesn't try to overturn Brexit like they tried and thankfully failed to do. And yes, a United States of America that defends its borders and looks out for itself and prioritizes trade that ultimately benefits American manufacturing and American workers above all else, rather than free trade, because that's the laissez-faire approach. That is the future. That is what an ideal world looks like.
Well, moving on to an issue that does affect people who are far away from the centers of power and far away from the cesspools of liberal internationalists. So as everyone knows, on February 3rd, there was a train that derailed in East Palestine, Ohio, and it was carrying extremely toxic, hazardous material. There were 50 cars who derailed. 10 of those cars were carrying chemicals. 5 of them were carrying vinyl chloride, which when burned creates phosphine, which was used in World War I as poison gas. To make matters worse, they actually did a controlled burn a day, I believe it was February 5th. They did a controlled burn because a lot of it had leaked out. They isolated it into a ditch and burned it. The flames could be seen 10 miles away. If you watch the videos, it looks like an atomic bomb went off, because it created a literal mushroom cloud. And there really wasn't a lot of coverage of this. Of course, a lot of this was occurring leading up to the Super Bowl and around the Super Bowl. So most of the country was either focused on that, or they were focused on so-called spy balloons, or the U.S. Air Force conducting target practice over Lake Michigan. So there really wasn't a lot of national coverage on this. Now, I found out days later that this even happened, and print media and digital media did do a fairly decent job of talking about it. But from my understanding, I don't really watch broadcast media that much, but from my understanding, there was very little coverage of this in the national broadcast press. It was basically just balloons, Super Bowl, and UFOs. Those were the top stories across the board, because that's what people are interested in.
That's right.
And, not many people know about this town.
Right. The 3 major TV networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, all combined together. These 3 channels spent approximately 30 seconds covering the train derailment. And this was almost 2 weeks after the fact. 30 seconds across 3 channels. That's 10 seconds per channel.
Yeah, and look, most people don't really read their news online, despite what people claim that, in the age of digital media, that's where everyone gets their news. Most people, if they do get their news online, it's from Facebook. And most people, Facebook has actually lost a lot of traffic over the past few years. So if broadcast media blacks something out, then it's going to cut down on a lot of the people, a huge portion of the country that would even know that it happened. If you're not, every day checking news sites, which most people don't do unless maybe if they're working an online job or working a remote job, they have extra time to check the, update CBS.com or ABCnews.com. Then ordinary people typically don't get this stuff. But, a lot of people have referred to this actually as the closest thing that America has ever experienced of a Chernobyl because it's a very small town. And a lot of people, they actually had to have a quarantine to evacuate everyone within a 1 mile radius of the train of where the derailment happened. A lot of people were claiming that they should have done like 5 miles or 10 miles because at this point, it's not really known how much damage this did to the environment, how much damage this is going to do to people's long-term health. And when you consider something like this, when you look back at the early 2000s, when the environmental movement was at its peak, when that not race was on the minds of every leftist, you would have had hundreds of thousands of people descending on this town, protesting against Norfolk Southern, which is the company that owns the train. I remember that there was a little town in Romania that wanted to frack, and they attracted tens of thousands of people from around the world in 2006 that descended on this one little bitty mountain village just because they wanted to open fracking. They attracted tens of thousands of activists, Americans, British from around the world who flocked to that village to protest because it was going to damage the environment. And there's crickets nowadays. Greta Thunberg isn't there.
Al Gore.
All these, Al Gore isn't there. All these climate freaks in Europe that are stopping trains on, that are blocking highways and freeways in Europe. They're not showing up. Nobody's saying a peep about this. And this is one of the largest environmental disasters in American history. And you take a look at it. It's not just speculation. I mean, there have actually been cases where people are noticing their animals are dying. We'll play this clip from this one woman who her camera caught her hens just fine before they did the controlled burn. Right after they did the controlled burn, she came out and noticed all of her hens were dead.
So I walked up to the cage, and this is what I found.
Amanda Brashears was going to feed her 5 hens and rooster this morning when she discovered them all lifeless, practically in the same position, with no signs of a predator entering their enclosure.
I'm beyond upset and quite panicked because they may be just chickens, but they're family.
Brashears says her chickens were alive and well yesterday. She believes the smell following the detonation of the train carrying chemicals that derailed in East Palestine is to blame for her birds' sudden death.
My video camera footage shows my chickens were perfectly fine before they started this burn. And as soon as they started the burn, my chickens slowed down and they died. If it can do this to chickens in one night, imagine what it's going to do to us in 20 years.
Officials have said that the smell wasn't toxic or dangerous, but still advised people in the Mahoning Valley to stay indoors Monday night as a precaution.
For them to say the air quality is okay, I'm calling BS. I'm going to be taking my birds to the vet to have them examined because if this is the cause of their burn, they're being held responsible.
And it was others as well. There's another clip here from people who noticed animals dead.
The Sunday after the derailment, I went to put them away for the night, and I had a dead rooster in my yard. Initially, I thought maybe just something random happened to it. I wasn't sure. I didn't put 2 and 2 together because we were told it was safe. And then I had another one that I found a few minutes later who was isolating himself. He did not go in for the night. I had to carry him into the coop. I had another one who was starting to walk funny.
You can see that his legs are just not working right. This is infuriating, and it's sad.
It was 2 days after the detonation. He completely couldn't walk anymore. He was completely coherent. If I put him by food and water, he would eat and drink perfectly fine, but he couldn't use his legs anymore. And I also, the same night, had a hen I put in the coop. She went up on the roost and then started seizing and fell off the roost. And it happened multiple times after that. She has since seemed to not be having those, so I don't know if it was the initial exposure that just messed with her system and now she's okay. I don't know what the long-term effects are. They were perfectly healthy before all this happened, and within 24 hours, they all dropped. That's just not normal, and it was all slightly different symptoms. I also had 2 rabbits die. They were within 24 hours. It was literally overnight. They just dropped. This is the fish.
Okay, so I went down to the creek right by my house, and mind you, we're almost 2 weeks later, and this is what we still have. There are literally hundreds of dead fish.
The stream that is contaminated, Leslie Run, runs right into my property. It dumps into the creek by my property. The EPA was saying, the fish are repopulating already, and I'm like, there was not one living thing in that creek. Not one. My heart goes out to the people that are even closer. I mean, I know what I'm dealing with. I'm not drinking my water. I don't trust it at all. This is our home. I grew up here. I was born here. Like, I know every road around here. I know just about everybody here. We can't just uproot and go. Like, it's a disaster.
Now, the Ohio EPA detected no contaminants in the 5 wells that feed into East Palestine's municipal water system. And they're claiming that the drinking water is fine, that they don't have to worry about that. But it's the public waters that people are mostly concerned about. And according to NBC's WLWT, the rivers and the creeks, they are positively contaminated from this controlled burn. Because, again, remember, they're burning all of this. So obviously when they burn this vinyl chloride, it releases these toxins into the air, and it's going to release it into the river. Senator J.D. Vance actually went to East Palestine and stood in a creek. We'll play a clip from his.
Hey guys, so I'm here at Leslie Run, and there's dead worms and dead fish all throughout this water. So, something I just discovered is that if you scrape the creek bed, it's like chemical is coming out of the ground. Can you come here? And let me just show this to people. I don't know if you're going to be able to see this on camera, but watch this. Just see that chemical pop out of the creek. This is disgusting. And the fact that we have not cleaned up the train crash, the fact that these chemicals are still seeping in the ground is an insult to the people who live in East Palestine. Do not forget these people. We've got to keep applying pressure. That's how we're going to fix this problem. Thank you.
So obviously, as this is an audio podcast, what happens in the video is he's holding a big stick and he sticks the stick into the water and scrapes it along the bottom of the creek. It's a very shallow creek, like maybe an inch or two deep. And when he does that, the water initially appears fine. He scrapes it across the bottom, and the chemicals that were at the bottom of the creek float up to the surface, and it becomes this kind of like this glossy, this multicolored glowing surface that very much looks like, I remember when I went to Pearl Harbor with my grandfather many years ago, and we got to go on the Arizona Memorial, and the platform that's over the wreckage of the ship, which is just below the surface. And to this day, almost 80 years, over 80 years later now, 80 years later, there is still oil gradually seeping up from the ship into the water, and it has that same kind of glossy appearance on the surface. It literally looks like an oil spill in this creek. And you can imagine, of course, plenty of other creeks and rivers in the area are affected like that. And the real reason, as you said, Jacob, why this could be one of the greatest environmental disasters in American history is because of the location's proximity to the Ohio River and all the subsequent basins and other tributaries that flow out from it and stretches across much of the Midwest and much of the Appalachian area that is there. So that is the imagine, if you will, just that crap in the Ohio River spreading across all those states. The crash itself was in an area of Ohio that's literally right on the border with Pennsylvania. It's not like this was in the middle of the state. This was already bordering another state already and affecting air quality probably in Pennsylvania as well. So just imagine this spreading through the rivers to so many other states in the Midwest, Kentucky, all those other states.
Yeah, because it's not just a matter of the drinking water that humans get. I mean, people can go to the store and buy bottles of water. The animals cannot. So you're going to have, you're talking about thousands and thousands of farms who are reliant on this water to drink. Sil Caggiano, he's a former fire department battalion chief in Youngstown, Ohio, and a hazmat technician for 21 years. He told the local WKBN news channel, he said, quote, "We basically nuked a town with chemicals so we could get a railroad open." And one of the top criticisms of locals was that as soon as they were told, basically as soon as the controlled burn ended and they got everything cleared, they were immediately running trains back through there. So like Norfolk Southern was like, let's clear the area, we'll get the thing burned off, and then we got to immediately get this going. So, burn the crime, not necessarily crime scene, but burn the accident scene, and so we can keep making money. So that's one of the issues at Norfolk Southern. Interestingly enough, so in order to atone for this accident, which, by the way, just as a little side note, workers of Norfolk Southern told CBS News last week that they had detected that the train had actually been having problems whenever it left Illinois, because the train was coming from Illinois. It had problems earlier on the track, and they didn't stop the train. They just kept going. And not only that, but the train was like 151 cars long. So that itself is a ridiculous length for any train to be going. So it's, in 50, and it's no wonder that they had 50 cars that ended up derailing. But and what's interesting is, not only did national media outlets not cover this much on broadcast, but the attitude among a lot of people is that, well, this is going to cause these locals to distrust institutions even more. Philip Bump wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post,
of course,
and in which he basically suggests exactly that. And the title of his op-ed is "The Other Risk from the East Palestine Disaster." And of course, you can guess what other risk he's talking about. He writes, quote, "The past few decades have been rough ones for American institutions from the presidency on down, but the past few years have been particularly rough for the institutions that had otherwise held up fairly well, scientists and medical experts particularly." And of course, he talks about the COVID-19 pandemic, how people were starting to distrust the CDC. They were starting to distrust the FDA.
Anthony Fauci. Gee, I wonder why.
Basically like, yeah, he's basically arguing that, yeah, this is terrible. In fact, he spends like 5 of the first paragraphs of this article talking about how none of this is good. It goes through everything that happened to controlled burn. None of this is good. Basically trying to cover his own rear, saying, I'm not saying that any of this isn't a tragedy. It is, but we need to be mindful that this is also going to make things more difficult for our team to renew trust in American institutions. And the problem with America's legacy media, like the Washington Post, is they're not necessarily news media. They are cheerleaders for the institutions.
Yes.
They basically exist as PR firms for America's institutions. And when something like this happens, it's like, oh, brother, here we go again. Now all these Ohioan rubes are going to start distrusting medical experts. Now they're going to start distrusting the EPA, as if we didn't have enough distrust among these rural people of the FDA already, or the FDA, the EPA, and all these other, 3-letter agencies already. So it's just the attitude. And then you got Buttigieg, who was supposed to be the transportation secretary. You would think that of all people, he would be out there. He would have visited East Palestine like 2 days after it happened. As soon as it was safe for him to go there, Buttigieg would be there. Not only is he the transportation secretary, but he's a former politician. He was a mayor in Indiana one state over.
And the guy who
so you would think that he would.
He was appointed transportation. When later, after he was confirmed, he was asked, what are your qualifications for transportation secretary? He literally said, I really like trains. I've liked trains ever since I was a kid. So he really should care about this. It's a train derailment. He should care.
Yeah. He should have been out there, talking to, if nothing else, at least talking to people and reassuring them that the government is going to do everything possible to make sure that they're safe and healthy and, everything is cleaned up. But no, here's what he had to say regarding this issue.
Rail safety is something that has evolved a lot over the years, but there's clearly more that needs to be done because while this horrible situation has gotten a particularly high amount of attention, there are roughly 1,000 cases a year of a train derailing.
So basically his excuse is, this happens all the time, don't you know? There's always trains derailing and unleashing basically a chemical Chernobyl on American towns. That happens all the time, folks.
It wasn't but a few days later, and another chemically full train derailed near Detroit. Like it was carrying toxic chemicals and it derailed. There were like 3 or 4 cars that fell off the tracks. Thankfully, it didn't start a fire. They didn't have to do a controlled burn. But, in a sense, he is not wrong. But at the same time, this isn't the way that you operate a government if you're trying to, if you are part of the citizens. And this is one of the things, this is kind of a theme with the Democratic Party, is they don't necessarily see themselves as part of the everyday man and everyday woman in America. They see themselves basically as teachers trying to get their students to want to learn.
Yes.
Like that's the role they see themselves. Like he doesn't see his job as serving. Yeah. Yes. He doesn't see his job as serving the public. He sees it as his job to reassure the public that this isn't a big deal and they don't need to freak out about it. Because, if you can convince people that train derailments are a normal thing, then they're not going to expect you to not make it not be a normal thing. Does that make sense? Like, if you're the transportation secretary, shouldn't it be your job to make it so that it's not a normal thing? But if you can convince people that it is a normal thing, then they won't expect much of you. And they'll just kind of throw up their hands. Okay, it's another toxic spill, whatever. We've got chemicals in the water. This is just life in America. But it's just disgusting because these people, they do not see, because they literally do not see themselves as part of the same class as these people. So they have to treat them as if these people are their underlings, convince them to believe in the institutions. So just to wrap it up, so Norfolk Southern, they're offering people $1,000. They're going around offering residents $1,000. Oh, and by the way, they decided to donate $25,000 to the Red Cross. So the Red Cross can then spend its money on temporary animal shelters to help all diseased and injured animals and displaced animals in the area.
$25,000
is what they're donating. And they're not even donating directly to an animal shelter. They're donating that money to the Red Cross in the hopes that the Red Cross will then throw some change, toward the animal shelter. It's
for an animal shelter. For not for people, for animals.
Yes. Oh. Well, so far, thankfully, we haven't had any reports of serious injury. But this is the thing with these chemicals. So the main chemical that was released, it's highly cancerous. Like there's like 4 or 5 different cancers that it causes. And so, we won't really know the effects of this on people for probably another 20 years. But a Cleveland attorney is warning East Palestine residents about a $1,000 check being offered to people as an inconvenience fee from Norfolk Southern. On Friday, February 3rd, a Norfolk Southern train derailed just outside of, we'll skip that. We already know that. So Michael J. O'Shea from the Lipson O'Shea Legal Group is representing residents in a lawsuit against the railroad and is worried about the reason behind the checks. He said, quote, "We have some clients from the East Palestine area affected by the train accident who are being approached by NS, that's Norfolk Southern, with $1,000 checks for an inconvenience fee. We think this is a way of getting these poor folks to waive any future claims against NS." And he is recommending that anyone who accepted the money sign a waiver immediately that stipulates that this does not remove them from being able to sue in the future, to sue for damages. So it's almost like Norfolk Southern. He's suspicious that Norfolk Southern is trying to bribe these people. Yeah. But I mean, you think about it in the grand scheme of things, $1,000 is not much money.
No,
when you consider the potential ramifications of this. And especially when you consider it's small as this town is. Like, it's not like it derailed in Pittsburgh and you've got potentially hundreds of thousands of people that you've got to buy off. Now, this is a very small town with a very small number of people that you're potentially going to need to pay damages to. And they're like, here, we'll throw you $1,000. Now shut up about it. Will you? Train derailments happen all the time.
It's so bad. And at the end of it, too, as has been said, a major reason, the big socio-political so what of this, is why do they care that, or why do they not care? Why do they, the establishment, the regime, the institutions, the media, why do they not care about this? Compare this to, say, this just came to me, Jacob, but compare this, if you will, to Flint. Remember a little something called Flint, Michigan? Remember the crisis there that the water... Oh, yeah. I don't remember the details even. I just knew apparently the water wasn't clean. It was, I guess, as Alex Jones would say, it was turning the frogs gay or something like that. But it was a national outrage. How could they let the water get so bad in a place like Flint? Well, gee, then you look at something like this in East Palestine, Ohio. I think we might notice a bit of a, shall we say, demographic difference there, Jacob, in terms of who which type of people live in Flint versus which type of people live in East Palestine. Kind of gets the old noggin jogging, doesn't it? So, kind of
does.
Of course, Flint, Michigan, it was predominantly an African American community. That's why you had so-called civil rights leaders claim this was proof of systemic racism and institutions deliberately making black people sick, stuff like that. And then here, of course, you have, as we saw in these videos, all the residents they spoke to in these videos at the town hall meetings, the ones going on Fox News for interviews, they are all white people. This, of course, it's Ohio. It's the Midwest. It is the white working class. The Ohio River and the states that are going to be affected by the chemicals in that river spreading to all these other states, it's predominantly affecting white states, majority white states. So, of course, and what is the white working class, Jacob? The backbone of the Trump movement. These are the people who put Donald Trump in office and gave these people now perpetual, endless night terrors over the Orange Man, right? So, of course, they see this as, I'm sure they'll never say this. I mean, some people are probably sick enough that they'll say this, but they generally won't say this. They see this almost as some kind of retribution. Like, oh, this is payback. These dumb rubes, these working class, redneck hicks kind of deserve this. This is what you get for voting for Trump, right? If they were to...
If you read comments on the internet, like the typical refrain is, well, these people voted for deregulation, so they're getting exactly what they deserve. Because, and it's true, this is kind of an argument against that we have with the Republican Party, is the fact that the Republican Party is in the pockets of big business. Like Norfolk Southern, they give equally to the Democratic and Republican parties. And of course, Norfolk Southern lobbies for deregulation of the rails, which contributes to accidents like this. So they're not necessarily wrong in that a lot of these Republican politicians have contributed to the problem by deregulating, but a lot of these people, they vote for Republicans just because the Democratic Party has a near genocidal view of them. So it's like, yeah, we'll take a little deregulation that could potentially put us in danger versus a party that literally wants to erase us from the country that our ancestors built. So it's a matter of trade-offs. And just real quick, just looking at what vinyl chloride is and does to people, this is from cancer.gov. Workers at facilities where vinyl chloride is produced or used may be exposed primarily through inhalation. The general population may be exposed by inhaling contaminated air or tobacco smoke. In the environment, the highest levels of vinyl chloride are found in air around factories that produce vinyl products. If a water supply is contaminated, vinyl chloride can enter household air when the water is used for showering, cooking, or laundry. Now, as far as the cancers that this could potentially produce, vinyl chloride exposure is associated with an increased risk of a rare form of liver cancer, hepatic angiosarcoma, as well as primary liver cancer, hepatocellular carcinoma, brain and lung cancers, lymphoma, and leukemia. So, this isn't anything to really sneeze at or, downplay. This is something that people should definitely take seriously. And it's something that they should have had a little bit more public debate on before deciding to have a public burn of vinyl chloride. Like the idea was, well, let's hurry up and get rid of it before it spreads. But whenever you burn it off like that, it's, you're potentially contaminating the air and you're obviously contaminating the water. So it's just an all-around mess. It's an all-around disaster. And again, we don't really know what kind of effect this is going to have on the people in the area for probably another 20 years.
Sounds kind of like the COVID vaccine, doesn't it? This is something they insisted would be fine.
Kind of similar. Very similar.
Just take it and worry about the effects 20, 30 years down the road when you can't sue any of these companies for the vaccine after effects, by the way. Good.
And of course, all the government officials in both cases are coming in and telling everyone everything is all right. It's okay. Nothing to worry about.
Everything's all right. Just trust the government, folks. Trust the government. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for this episode of The Right Take. Thank you guys so much, as always, for tuning in. Be sure to follow us for all of our latest content at our website, righttakepodcast.com. The full list of social media websites and podcast platforms where we are available, righttakepodcast.com/subscribe. And as always, if ever you guys are feeling oh so generous and want to continue supporting what we do here on the show, righttakepodcast.com/support. We'll talk to you next week, guys.